Good afternoon. It is Monday, October 7th at about 3:33 p.m. It's time for the Transportation Commission. We'll call roll. David Ballard, David McKinney, absent Ryan Lancaster,
Present.
Ryan Hall.
Here.
Tracy Hopkins.
Here.
Steve Lewis.
Here.
Ryan Leslie.
Here.
Tom Leclerc.
Present.
Michael Vennard. Luke Kavanagh. John Martin.
Here.
Tony Tisdale. Ian Updike.
Here.
Elisa Tansom.
Here.
Did I get that right?
No. It's Alyssa Taysom.
Taysom.
Yeah.
Okay. Elisa Taysom. You're here. Thank you. Justin Price.
Here.
Okay, adoption of the agenda. Any comments, questions?
I make a motion, we adopt the agenda as written.
Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, item 2, approval of the minutes. We have August 5, 2019, and an abbreviated set of minutes for September 9th, 2019. Mr. Lewis?
Mr. Chairman,
Yes, sir.
just a couple of minor things on page 7 of 34.
Page 7 of 34, yes, sir.
In that bottom paragraph, the 8th line from the bottom, where it says, "and the estimated crashes / lives," I think it should read. And
Sounds
then,
right.
And then the very last line, make the system safer with an F, I believe, was the intent. And those are the only comments I have.
Put an F for the V in savor.
Yes, please.
Okay. Any other comments on either set of minutes? Is there a motion to approve with the amendments as noted by Mr. Lewis?
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
And second, all in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, we're adopted on August 5 and September 9 minutes. Old business for a transportation projects update, Mr. Hood.
Mr. Chair, members of the commission, I will run through, beginning on page 14 in your packet, transportation project updates. We do have a couple of new folks in the audience anyway, so just for their benefit, but also for yours. Every month I'll put together this memo. A lot of it is older or continuing information. Anything new is in bold, and I will highlight some of those, but won't talk about all the projects on the list. But again, I'll leave some time at the end of my summary if I glossed over something or didn't bring something up either in the memo or not. Feel free to bring them up. So again, with that said, page 14 of the memo, the first one I want to call to your attention is Meridian Road Charity U-Stick. I don't know if you've driven out there in the past month, but there's utility relocations going on for Idaho Power. In particular, there's a bunch of trees that have been removed, and I think I haven't been out that way in about a week or so, but they're probably about done at this point. But you'll start to see Idaho Power start to put up their poles and whatnot, kind of on the backside. So that's the project with that information in there. Central Paving is working on that, and again, what you see right now is the utility relocations, and they'll hit it really hard after the first of the year. Linda Road, Franklin Pine, I also wanted to just call your attention to that project, as that one will be moving forward here probably later this month between, again, Franklin and Pine on Linda Road. So that includes the railroad crossing. That's a pretty big project. We were hoping it would have gotten done when that intersection at Pine and Linder was done, but that'll be nice to have that section completed here this next year as well. Then jumping to page 15, kind of a similar update on 10 Mile U-Stick to McMillan. That project, again, will be going into construction here later this fall as well, maybe probably later this month. So just be aware of that. Locust Grove Victory to Overland. So there was a public involvement meeting that ACHD hosted last month. Did some 50% design plans that they shared with the public. There was a summary of that public involvement meeting that we received from ACHD. It's split a little bit on, and I didn't count, I don't know if it's 50-50, but there is some concern with by the adjacent neighborhoods on the impacts that a 5-lane roadway is going to have on, again, those subdivisions primarily that are in that section. So we're going to talk tomorrow night to the council and just sort of daylight that with the council as well. But wanted you to know that, again, there's some in the community that aren't real happy with a 5-lane roadway going in there, where the preservation hasn't always been for 5 lanes. ACHD's preserved basically an acquired right away for a 3-lane facility, and now trying to fit a 5-lane roadway in that right of way, which basically takes up a lot of landscape buffers that are in those subdivisions. We're also working with them and talking with them a little bit about what the bike and pedestrian environment looks like. There maybe are some options for some alternative cross sections. One of the things that we've talked about is a dual purpose facility that could either be attached or detached from the curb, but basically instead of putting the bike lane below the curb, maybe making it wider and putting it on the other side of the curb. So there's some options that way that we want to, again, largely daylight and see if the council has any input on the cross section that's out there now. You can also look at that project on the project website, on ACHD's website. I think I'm going to jump then to page 18 and just quickly mention State Highway 16, I-84 to Orchard and Cuna. This has been on your future meeting topics the last couple of months anyways. And I'll coordinate with Mr. Wasdall or Mr. Price at a future meeting to get an update. There's actually a project team meeting tomorrow. But essentially, 6 Mile Engineering is looking at, in 2040, some of the traffic volumes on State Highway 69 as a 4, 5, 6-lane facility, what the access and adjacent network looks like with collector roadways and intersection improvements and under road overpass or no overpass, and some of those scenarios and playing them out. So we have a agency review meeting tomorrow to look at some of those preliminary findings from that project. And again, we'll share some more of that information here later this fall with you. And then moving on to page 19 then, a quick update on transit. And I'll let Stephen Hunt, Stephen's here. Would you mind coming up, Stephen? You can either there or up front, either way. But VRT did win a grant award earlier this year for some electric buses. I don't know if any of you saw the Meridian press article. There was a press article about this information, so they beat us to the punch a little bit there. But wanted to just kind of ask Stephen to give a quick update, not only on the grant, but just the overall project in Meridian, and to let you know that this will be probably a standing meeting agenda item, if not every month and maybe every other month, to talk about this and kind of use you as that sounding board and to start the process with stop locations, amenities, some of the things I think you talked about on your. I was the shuttle bus driver, so I wasn't there for a lot of the conversation. But anyway, Stephen, if you wouldn't mind.
Sure, thank you. And I thought I might also take a moment. You met Alyssa Taysom. She'll be staffing this committee going forward, and so she has some things that she can share on this topic as well. But as a result of the work that we did beginning last year on getting transit services into Meridian, we went out for a grant application for a number of electric vehicles and were successful in that. That grant was for 8 electric vehicles, 6 replacement vehicles in Ada County and 2 expansion vehicles, which would allow us to extend peak hour service into Meridian. So we're limited in the amount of service that we can run any given hour by the size of our fleet. And we had been running at our capacity we are currently running at our capacity. And so what these replacement vehicles will allow us to do is retire old vehicles, but also expand the number of vehicles we can have in service in the peak hour, which is when the demand for transit and transportation is the highest. So we had to do that before we could extend service into Meridian during the peak period, the peak hours of service. And so those 2 expansion vehicles allow us to bring service into Meridian along the corridor that we discussed previously. So from 10 Mile to Kleiner Park is what we have been talking about. And I think if I could, Caleb, I'll have Alyssa talk a little bit about the schedule for that service.
Yeah, so right now, we have everything broken down by quarters as we approach deploying the electric buses in the service in Meridian. We're working right now on putting together a meeting with some of the community stakeholders, specifically the developers over at the Meridian Village in Meridian, so that we can talk to them about like the stops, what our schedule is, alignment, that sort of thing. And we're also looking at the design of the shelters as they go out. Next quarter, we're going to be doing more of the public outreach with the community members here in Meridian, and then taking everything to the board quarter 3, getting that service change agreed to, what the alignment's going to be, and that sort of thing.
And I'll add a quick thing to that. One of the reasons that we are going to take the alignment to the VRT board third quarter, which means third quarter in the fiscal year, so second quarter of 2020, is because we need a little bit more time to be putting some of the stations and shelters that we envision in downtown Meridian, as well as at around Kleiner Park and at 10 Mile Crossing. We'll need a little bit more time to get those capital projects in place for start of service in in the spring of 2021, when the electric vehicles would become available. So we'll be engaging the community, as Alyssa mentioned. Really, the first part of next year is when we want to be talking to them in more detail. And this quarter, so between now and the start of the year, really getting on the same page with stakeholders and other bodies in Meridian and you all.
Very good. Any questions or comments for either Mr. Hunt or Ms. Taysom? Steve, if I may ask a question. The longevity or the capacity, these electric buses, is that a service for a full day's work, or how much juice is in the bus?
Oh, how far can they drive? Yeah, on a single charge. Proterra says that they can go. Proterra is the vendor that we'll be procuring the buses from, and they have a range of about 180 miles, but it depends on temperature and other factors. So we kind of say that was the optimistic view, but we're hoping to get at least 120, 180 miles on a single charge. So where we would be using them would be in the peak hours in the AM and the PM, and so on a single bus we would be well within the range of those electric vehicles.
Okay.
And as battery technology expands, the 300 plus miles would be more than enough for us to be running any of the services that we don't have any technically they're called blocks of service that would exceed, I think 250 or so is our longest maybe.
Okay. And those will be serviced where you plug them in at night, or?
Yeah, so we'll have chargers at the Orchard facility, which is where all of the buses return at night, and that's where they'll be charged. We have been looking into the option of having overhead chargers, so something that we would install en route, maybe a Main Street station or other places where they could get a charge during the day. That's one way you could extend the service. It's not really service life, but how long it could be, the span of service for the day is by having an overhead charger where they could plug in, get a quick charge, and then keep going.
Okay. Anything else for,
Mr. Chairman?
yes?
Stephen, I may have missed it. Were there public information hearings about this year, or are those starting in 2020?
We did have public outreach going into this as we were developing the concepts for it. It was back in April-ish, I believe. And we held an open house here at City Hall to talk about transit services and got some input on the different corridors that between Cherry Lane, Pine, and Franklin, where people saw the need. And so that was an initial look. We will be engaging the public again as we take the final concepts to them, and in particular around the alignment of the service, which we want to have the board, the VRT board, that is, take action on that in April of next year,
2020.
2020.
Okay. All right. So we'll look for that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Bet. Any other questions, comments? Very good. Appreciate the update.
And Mr. Chair, just as we move on to other updates there, I think the schedule that Ms. Taysom kind of gave, I think I've seen that schedule, and we can probably come up with a similar version for you next month that kind of shows at what points we'll want you to engage and be part of that, even as before we go to the public again with some of these, where you all are here too and live here, work here. Where do you think are good alternatives for stops and even the routes? Generally, we have an idea of where the route goes, but there are some options within that. So anyways, I think we can probably get together here in the next few weeks or whatever and come up with a schedule that shows you all that schedule. And again, those touch points where we really want you to be involved in helping to develop this service. So,
Mr. Chair?
Yes.
Caleb, there was a public survey that went out on the route preferences. I think it was public, wasn't it? Did I get it in the email? It wasn't just the commission, right? It was public?
correct, yeah, and that's at the same time this spring that we had the open house here at City Hall. I don't remember exactly how we noticed people do it. I think you had to self-select into it, so you had to go to the city's website or find it somewhere else. We didn't, with VRT, spam people, I don't think. I can't remember now. Sorry, put Steven on the spot again. I don't remember.
We used social media, and I believe we did send out emails directly to our list of folks to solicit feedback on those concepts, yes.
Okay. Did you get a very good response?
Off the top of my head, I think we got a reasonable response. There were, trying to think, because we had a number of different types of surveys that we were using throughout that time period, not only about the alignment, but about transit in general. And when we took all those together, there were a couple hundred comments from the city of Meridian on transit. I'm trying to remember how many were specific to the routing, and I'd have to double check on that.
Okay. It might be helpful for us to see, what the public input was for the routing when we talk about the routing here.
And Mr. Chair, Commissioner, Brian Parker did provide you some of those survey results in the summertime, a few months ago. There were two surveys that went out kind of concurrently. One was more broadly geared towards the public. If a bus were to go down Fairview or Pine and here, would you use it or where would you go type of questions. The other one was geared towards employers that were along those corridors, to ask them the question, if we bring it, will you ride type of question. So it was a survey more towards employees that were along the corridor. And I think that's more of what Mr. Parker kind of reported out versus the public survey. We can make a note, and maybe again next month, maybe that's great to, I think, refresh and educate you all on what we've heard thus far as we move to the next steps.
Right.
Use that as a baseline, so that makes a lot of sense to refresh you all with those results.
That'd be great. Thank you.
Okay, transportation projects update. Caleb, we're finished with 4A, or you got just
One more, I just want to call your attention, one more thing, actually two. ACHD's integrated 5-year work plan was adopted on September 25th, so there's a link there if you want to go check out the final version of it. And then finally, air compression brakes. So I wanted to just circle back because that's been the topic of a couple different meetings, so I wanted to just disclose and let you know, October 15th, there will be a city council meeting, and I attached the draft ordinance in your packet. So just closing the loop on that one, or if you want to talk about it, we can, but there is that public hearing then next Tuesday here in Chambers.
Mr. Lancaster.
Mr. Chairman, so I would like to talk about this proposed ordinance a little bit. I see that it was discussed at the August meeting that I missed, so I apologize for backtracking a little bit. But, like Caleb says, we have talked about this in the past, and I'm curious, what am I trying to say here? So I see in the August meeting minutes that there was some discussion about, or some comments on the proposed ordinance, and that those comments would be integrated in. So I guess if you'll indulge me, what were some of those comments from the August meeting about this compression brake proposed ordinance?
So, Mr. Chair, I can tackle that one, although others were here too. There were really two things that came out from that. One was a question, I think it was Mr. Chair that brought it up, defining what air brakes are was one of the concerns. And the other one was, again, Mr. Parker had a concern with their buses kneeling and using compression brakes or air compression to kneel a bus. And so Emily Kane was here for that meeting, took that back, and she's the one that drafted these ordinances. Those are the two that really came out, and just making it clear what air compression brakes are, and so that enforcement and even the definition of that, what are we really trying to prohibit here? And then again, an exemption for public buses when they kneel.
Okay. So, Mr. Chairman and others, do you think that those comments were adequately addressed?
Mr. Chairman, I have a,
I can respond to Mr. Lancaster's question, but Mr. Lewis, go ahead.
on the word air and the air compression brakes, I know that was a point of discussion quite a bit last time we talked about this, and it does reference Idaho Code 49.1, the definitions part of that title. And in my quick search, I couldn't find air compression brakes defined in the code, so I'm not sure if that's addressed yet.
I had the same findings this afternoon.
Okay.
I gather that the reference to Idaho code is for a definition of what a truck is, because, yeah, there's no definition of what air compression brakes are in law. Yeah,
You agree with me?
I do, more often than not.
Wow.
Yeah,
Can I quote you on that?
yeah.
Well, Mr. Lancaster, Mr. Lewis, I think that deserves a little further research if air compression brake is the correct terminology. My general understanding is simply a compression brake, which works off the engine's exhaust, and that's further distinguished between unmuffled and muffled compression brakes, which meet some federal decibel standards. Mr. Baird, how might we invite Ms. Kane to revisit that?
Well, Mr. Chair, it appears that the definition takes air out of consideration. I mean, air is in there. People know them as air brakes, but if you look at 7113A, air compression brakes are defined without the use of the term air. It's just a device that alters the operation of an engine's exhaust to slow a vehicle or truck. I think that was how she attempted to address that. If you want to have further comments, to take out air altogether, I can take that back to her. I don't know if that's going to put off the consideration at City Council on October 15th. I think there was the understanding that this was fully vetted at the August meeting. And as far as muffled and unmuffled, I thought we'd discuss that as well, and it obviously didn't make the draft. If you feel strongly about it, I'll take that back to her, but
Well, I want to be careful. Air brakes refers to the standard braking system on a semi. Compressed air pushing the regular brake pads. So I think that there may be trying to think of the proper term. I don't think air compression is the right description. I think you talk about compression brakes. And I would just ask her to check on that, and I'd be happy, if I may, without overstepping any boundaries, speak with her generally.
sure,
I could give her a call.
sure. And quite frankly, I don't know if the unmuffled versus muffled was considered and disregarded in the interest of simplicity. I think with the exceptions that were in there, under emergency circumstances that have prevented an accident, I think that was more important than trying to get into whether it was muffled or unmuffled. If somebody heard it, they don't care if it's muffled or unmuffled. I think that's where that went, but
Okay.
we can talk about that as well. But yeah, if it would help to add to that definition, to take out the word air and just call it compression brakes, that's certainly an easy thing to do, both the title and the definition.
Okay?
But yeah, I'll offer up your technical advice as well.
I need to just review that a little bit, and then I'll get in touch with her.
Okay, I'll send her an email right now.
Okay, thank you. Thank you,
Mr. Chairman, if I
Further comments?
Yeah, if I may provide a couple more comments. And I'm not going to pretend to be a truck expert. Both our chairman and former chairman are both, I'm sure, more expert than I am. But I did spend the last 2 weeks diversifying my skill set here a little bit, working on potato harvest on the in-laws potato farm. So I, was driving a diesel truck with air brakes, right? And so I think I've diversified a little bit now. But I think the issue of muffled or unmuffled is, I remember discussing that at some length when we talked about this, whenever we talked about this before. I do think that that's an important topic to take up. I remember some of the discussion being if the brakes are muffled, then you're not going to hear them anyway, right? So I guess that kind of leads me to what's the problem that we're trying to solve here? Are we trying to prohibit use of a device, that an operational device, or are we trying to reduce noise? Because nothing in here talks about noise, right? It's about a device. So why are we prohibiting a device if there's not, a stated benefit of why you would do that? And then I guess just terminology. So we've talked a little bit about whether air should be there or not. you know, I think all of these vehicles have air brakes, right? And then talking about compression brakes, you know, this might be language that's been used by others, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's right? So all braking systems are compression systems, right? So just calling it compression brakes, well, does that mean that anything that compresses anything for braking can't be used, right? So I don't know what to suggest there other than I'm not sure that air compression brakes seems right. So I've probably waded into water deeper than I should already, but those are some of my thoughts about this. So, you know, I wish Councilman Cavanagh were here, because as written, I would encourage him to vote no on this ordinance, because I don't think that it achieves anything, that it's written to achieve anything, or that it's written, you know, I'd be interested in what Sergeant Frazier might have to say about it, but I'm not sure that it does anything enforcement-wise, right? Is it just a page of ordinance for the sake of being a page of ordinance, or can something actually be done about it, you know, enforcement-wise? So, you know, for those reasons, I would encourage our city council to vote no on it currently.
Any other questions, comments?
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
Yeah, I think I agree with Commissioner Lancaster. I mean, there's some questions about the language, but the structure of the city is pretty much a grid where the heavy trucks are. We're not having. I mean, I've not been familiar with noise problems with trucks on residential streets. I mean, most of our arterial streets is where the heavy truck traffic is, and that's where it should be, and they make noise, and if that driver needs to stop, I think we want him to have the choices available to him to stop. And so I don't really, there's some questions about these definitions, but I think generally I don't really see the value of it. We can tell them to not use those kind of brakes, but it seems like there's question in my mind, is that a safe thing to tell them in all cases? We don't know what their load is. We don't know what's happening in their trailer when they have to hit a different braking system. I just think this is kind of beyond what we need to do as a city. So and we talked about definitions, but I think it would have been, after I left the meeting, I thought, well, why didn't we just have a discussion of the concept generally, you know, and give a recommendation to the council, you know, the Transportation Commission, you know, supports or opposes this whole concept. And I think that might have been a good thing for us to do in August, but we could do it today, surely, and it might make a difference on this.
Well, Mr. Hood, I appreciate the comment. Mr. Hood, I'm trying to recall, review past sessions, but my memory, if it serves me, is that this commission did not recommend that the city council take up this ordinance or an ordinance, and on its own volition or from another perspective, this ordinance is before the city council.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, I don't exactly remember how it got back to the council, but you're correct in that this body didn't recommend that the council move forward with this, but that wasn't enough for them to consider. Now, it's not adopted yet, it's not a done deal, but they did ask direct staff to draft the letter, or draft the ordinance, excuse me. I will just a little bit of history, because some of you weren't here when we had folks that addressed you about a year ago now, probably, on 10 Mile Road, and the use of compression brakes along that corridor sort of serving as a de facto extension of State Highway 16 to get to I-84. So there are some neighborhoods that were complaining about noise. And the intent isn't, and I think there's some reality in this, and I will speak for Chief Levy, just because he was part of a discussion we had. He's not a big fan of this ordinance either, because enforcement is going to be near impossible. The officers essentially have to witness it, and the chances of them being there and seeing a truck driver use this and pull them over and write them a ticket it's just not going to happen. And they recognize that, and that's been disclosed to council. The intent, though, of this, right or wrong, I'm just telling you what some of the thought process was. So if we put it on the books, we can put up signs educating truck drivers, you are now entering the city limits, and use of air brakes or compression brakes or whatever is prohibited within city limits. We can't do that if we don't have an ordinance that actually says, if there were to be an officer that witnessed this, we could write you a ticket. But again, it's really more an education component about being able to put up signs to say, welcome to Meridian. It's a family-friendly, quiet environment. Please don't use your air brakes. Essentially, that's really all that's the main intent of this, is to put up signs educating, asking truck drivers to do the right thing and just remind them that they're entering a residential area, basically.
Mr. Lancaster.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, that's helpful insight from Caleb, from Mr. Hood. I guess to go down that rabbit hole, if I may briefly, so the ordinance doesn't say anything about signs. If that's the purpose of the ordinance, then, well, presumably the purpose is to prevent noise. And if, the tool to do that is through an ordinance and a sign, so the ordinance doesn't say anything about a sign, nor would I encourage it to include language about signs. So, I don't know what Ada County Highway District's practice is regarding signs for compression brake prohibitions. I think I can safely say that other agencies in the state may discourage, may not be so excited about those kinds of signs. So, and frankly, of cities or local jurisdictions dictating to, the road agency of what signs they must put up, right? So I guess, I'm less than excited about more sign, being an end product. So I guess to tie that up, Mr. Chairman, I think it might be wise for us, and I can make a motion this way if it's, if it's prudent, but for us to, again, as this body, to make a recommendation to the city council, either, in favor of the ordinance, not in favor of the ordinance, or perhaps hold the ordinance for, more work. I've already stated I would be I don't like the ordinance. So I would, my encouragement would be as a body for us to recommend to the city council that this not become an ordinance. So.
That's your motion?
Yeah, let me state it a little more clearly. So, Mr. Chairman, I move to recommend from the Transportation Commission to the City Council to not vote in favor of this proposed ordinance.
Mr. Chair, before the motion is complete, it might be instructive for the maker of the motion to list the reasons that you've discussed here today, and that can go directly to the council with your motion. Just a suggestion.
I think that's wise advice.
Okay, well, let's see if I can remember what I said. So in an amendment to the motion, so for reasons for not approving the ordinance would be, it's not clear what the purpose of the ordinance is. The ordinance isn't currently stated clearly enough, that there's enforceability issues about the ordinance, that it would become just an ordinance on paper versus something that we can actually do something about. I think those were my main talking points. So that's the end of my motion, Mr. Chairman.
Okay,
Chairman, I second it.
I have a second. All for the vote, all in favor? Aye.
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 Any opposed?
Nay.
We have 2 to, well, let's do a roll call then. Mr. Lancaster?
Aye.
Mr. Lewis?
Nay.
Mr. Hall? Mr. Hopkins?
Yes.
Ballard, I voted yes. Leslie?
Nay.
Mr. Leclerc?
Yes, in favor of the motion.
All right. So it's five yes, 2 nays. So the motion is not to, okay. So that is our recommendation. All right. Okay, so that concludes transportation projects update, Mr. Hood.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, I'm sorry, the 10 minutes that I estimated that to take, I missed the mark there, so.
Okay. Just a little over. Okay. New business, excuse me, point of protocol. Ms. Taysom,
Yes.
as it is our custom or maybe tradition, when new members join, we always invite them to give them a few minutes to introduce themselves. So tell us a little bit about where you're from and what you're doing and why you're here.
Well, I'm actually originally from Boise. Grew up there, went to Capitol High School, moved to Kuna about 10 years ago, and then a year and a half ago I moved to Bozeman, Montana. I have my bachelor's degree in political science from Boise State and a master's in community and regional planning as well from Boise State. And I moved to Bozeman because that was the first place I got a job after graduating. But it's cold there. I worked for the university, Montana State University, for the facilities service as a campus planner. And we got so much snow last year that we lost 2 of our gyms from the 70s. That was a bit too much snow for me. So I moved back, just started with VRT a little over a month ago. And I'm really happy to be back where the most snow that we'll ever get is probably 8 inches. And it's gone within a few weeks, not a month. So yeah, but longtime resident of the valley. I've got family all over the place. I'm back out in Kuna. So yeah, I'm just really happy to be back.
Well, we appreciate that and welcome to this commission. Thank you. Moving on. New business, item 5A, Police Department update. We have a new face, and I would introduce you, sir, but
We have a new face. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Sergeant Frazier. I work for the Meridian Police Department. I took the position of Sergeant Stacy Arnold. He got rotated out of the traffic team as a supervisor. I've been with Meridian since 2007. I've been in law enforcement about 15 years, which seems like a while, but when I was a kid, I read about Stacy Arnold when he was a cop in Emmett in the newspaper. And he'll be retiring in a couple of years, actually. So I've been thrown into the ring in a number of arenas. This being one of them. Obviously, I've got a background in impaired driving. That's one of my areas of specialty. And I have contacts all throughout ITD, OHS, ACHD, the ISP, and various other police organizations as well. That's about all I have to say for myself. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask. If there's anything I can do for you in my office with the commission, feel free to ask. And I believe I have the next agenda item as well. Is that accurate?
Yes.
Sergeant, is there a particular assignment or area of focus, or what do you like to do best?
Well, what I like to do best fits into my role in the police department. I'm a team leader, and I've been the leader of several teams as a supervisor in the police department. I like to fix problems and address issues that affect workflows, community safety, and things like that. There's no area of policing that I prefer over another, really. I just sort of gravitate towards things that need fixed and things I can do within the organization to make it work better and work better with other things. And I've had the opportunity to do that in a lot of different arenas: K-9 units, impaired driving, highway safety, judicial processes, and now with the traffic team. So that's what I like to do most.
Okay. Comments, questions for Sergeant Frazier? Commissioners? Okay, well, welcome, and we look forward to your monthly report, sir.
Thank you. I will be here.
Stay safe.
Thanks.
5B, hands-free driving ordinance discussion. You're up again, Sergeant.
Thank you. As I understand it, well, I know for a fact this was obviously scheduled to be heard at last week's council meeting. That was set over to this week's council meeting. Chief Levy wanted to make sure and share with you all, if you have any input now or after our discussion here, to share with the council members. Please feel free to do so in writing or appearing in person at tomorrow's meeting at 4:30 and at 6. Chief Levy will be there as part of the public discussion, and that will be a first reading of the proposed ordinance. I can tell you, and we can talk about this as many questions as you have, it loosely prohibits the usage of handheld wireless devices upon highways or roadways within the city of Meridian. That's a pretty broad scope when you start breaking it down legally, but that's what the ordinance is about. There's a couple proposals about penalties for the ordinance if you violate the ordinance. One is to have a fixed cost penalty, which would be around $90, similar to a speeding ticket. There's another constituency that prefers a graduated or increasing fee schedule for that would start at around $90 and move up from there with subsequent convictions or history of doing that. I will tell you from a law enforcement perspective, that sounds like a good idea, and it is, but it's very difficult for the law enforcement officer writing the ticket to figure out if that person's ever been convicted of that city code violation before. And most of the time, it's functionally impossible for the law enforcement officer to do that. So outside of general discouragement, I don't see that accomplishing the goals that some think that it might. There's also some exemptions or exceptions to that ordinance having to do with people using a cell phone to report an emergency, medical, law enforcement, or otherwise, as well as for police officers, paramedics, and firefighters that are in executing their duties and needing to use a handheld wireless device, which would include a cell phone or a computer that is inside a police car or a fire truck, for example. There's also exceptions having to do with navigation devices, so long as they're not manually held or manipulated, typed into in order to get your destination. And there's exceptions for certain voice operated or primarily voice activated devices as well. So without an official first reading in front of council, there's not a lot of, the city and the police department hasn't received a lot of input because nobody knows what to give their input about. But that is the update that I can share with you on the ordinance. And again, Chief Levy extends his invitation to appear tomorrow in person or to provide any input you have by writing. So I'd be happy to take any questions if there is any.
Commissioners, questions? Mr. Lancaster, looked like you,
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, and I apologize if I'm hogging the microphone. Feel free to call on others if they want to talk too. But I guess my question for you, Sergeant Frazier, is, and I recognize that you may not have all the answers here, so we're all doing our best. But I introduced myself to you before the meeting. I've been on this commission and the prior commission for a while now, starting with when Sergeant John Gonzalez had your job. And this is a topic that comes up every few years. So, it's not the first time I've been at this rodeo, although this is the first time we've had an ordinance drafted, it appears, or as I recall. But my question for you is what hole is this ordinance filling? Is there a gap in current ordinances, distracted driving or whatever, I guess that's my question. What gap is this trying to fill?
Yeah, Commissioner Lancaster, I understand. It's a multifaceted question and answer. One of the things that comes to mind for me is we receive phone calls all the time from people calling and complaining that such and such person was on a phone and they almost crashed into me. It's because they're distracted by their phone. And that's probably true, but there's a number of people in the general public who assume or think that it should be illegal in some form to drive while using your cell phone, and it is in a number of other areas throughout Idaho and certainly in some neighboring states. The gap or the hole, I would say, primarily has to do with when somebody is in a crash, which we have a couple of those that happen every year in Meridian, right around 1,500 to 2,000 of them. When you look at existing state code in dealing with what the person that was doing that caused that crash, sometimes the hands of law enforcement is tied to a degree because the only applicable statute we can point to or cite in that traffic crash is the misdemeanor charge of inattentive driving. Sometimes that code is the applicable one, that is one that should be used under the right circumstances. However, when you start breaking down the reasons why crashes happen elementally, if somebody is following a vehicle down Eagle Road and they're distracted momentarily by their cell phone, perhaps it's better to be able to cite them for using a handheld wireless device rather than having to cite them for a misdemeanor charge of inattentive driving, which costs potentially $100 or $200 or $250 more, because what we run into is people are not telling us they're using their cell phone. A lot of people realize that if they admit to doing that, they're looking at a more intense charge. It's a misdemeanor on the record rather than an infraction. And in those cases, we're torn between using a couple infraction codes that vaguely fit that situation, some of them better than others, or citing for inattentive driving. Every case is a case-by-case basis, but I can certainly think several crashes in my career if the use of a cell phone while driving ordinance was in effect, that would have been the most applicable and the fairest reason to write somebody a ticket should they cause a minor crash.
Mr. Chairman.
Lancaster, I'll give you a follow-up.
Okay, and Sergeant Frazier, so you'll have to help me out here with the terminology a little bit, but so this would be an infraction, whereas the inattentive driving is a misdemeanor, which is kind of a whole different level of naughtiness, I guess.
Yeah,
right?
misdemeanor is a criminal charge.
Yeah.
An infraction is a civil offense.
Yeah.
An infraction is not something you can go to jail for. Penalties or fees for infractions are generally much lower in terms of financial impact than they are for a misdemeanor charge. Arrest warrants aren't generated, et cetera. Sometimes there's collateral costs caused by writing people misdemeanor charge citations that they then don't pay. It creates a workflow through the judicial system to create a arrest warrant for that person and have it executed and et cetera. But yeah, an infraction is a much lower threshold than a misdemeanor charge would be.
Okay. Thanks for explaining the legal stuff to me.
Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Hopkins?
I think I said this last time, and the problem I see with the cities writing these into code or ordinances is, okay, it's not, you can't do it in Meridian, but it's okay to do it in Boise, and it's okay to do it in Nampa, and it seems like this would be better suited I'm all for to get people off their phones and when they're driving, drive. But when it's hit and miss in which cities that's acceptable and not acceptable, it seems like it's more of a state issue rather than a city issue. And I know that's not a question, but it just seems like it just makes people cheat or get caught. Well, I thought I was in Boise. It's okay in Boise, but it's not okay in Meridian.
Yeah.
It just confuses people and causes a bigger issue.
I think I can respond to that. Obviously, the question is at a state level, the issue hasn't been addressed. State code didn't really contemporaneously even acknowledge the fact that people were using electronic or handheld wireless devices in their vehicle. It took a while to adopt a definition for that. The cities that have put an ordinance like this into play are much smaller than Meridian. They don't share intimate boundaries with other cities, like Blaine County or Haley does. Certainly, your average citizen and even average police officer sometimes has a hard time knowing if they're in Meridian, unincorporated Ada County, or Boise. So there's a huge education component to this as well. It's definitely not a situation where my officers running the traffic team, my team would deal with this ordinance the most. In no means can we, day one that ordinance goes into effect, just start citing people galore. And I don't think that's the intention either. To me, it's most useful after a period of public education, signage on the roadways, things of that nature. And it's most applicable when we discover that somebody has crashed their car or committed something noticeable because they are using their handheld wireless device, and it doesn't necessarily amount to inattentive driving at large. The road forward for law enforcement for an ordinance like this in Meridian is tenuous. I'll give you that. It's hard to enforce. It's hard to find judicial precedent for enforcement in Ada County for an ordinance like this. But the flip side of that is if the state were to someday adopt a similar finding, that would take a long time. And I can tell you that a number of the crashes that we have that are attributed to aggressive or inattentive driving, distracted driving, are cell phone or handheld wireless device driven.
Sergeant, from the cities that have banned cell phones, are there any statistics as how that has lowered or impacted the crash rate?
I'm not aware of any specifically. The data point that ITD uses to measure crashes that are attributed to cell phone use alone or that cell phones were a contributing factor for is actually a fairly new data point.
Okay.
And I would argue that the data that they capture is not, I don't want to say it's inaccurate, but it's not as accurate as it could be because it's self-report data, and it requires the police officer writing the report to be cognizant of any and all contributing factors to that crash and then report it. If an officer has a choice of inattention versus distracted by a cell phone, those can be the exact same thing, or they can be two different things, or the officer may choose one or the other, if that makes sense.
Okay. Good. Any other questions, comments for Sergeant Frazier?
Mr. Chairman?
Mr. Leslie?
So, as a vulnerable road user myself, I am acutely aware of distracted drivers out there. And my kids ride their bikes to school, so all the more so. With regards to Commissioner Hopkins' comment about the state being the entity that should be addressing this, he's absolutely right. But our state has been kicking this down the road for 3 years, and they still haven't done anything. And if you watch the debate or read about the debate on this exact statewide ordinance last year, it was chaos. They couldn't figure out what to do with it. So the cities are finally starting to say, hey, the state's not going to deal with it. We need to deal with it because people are dying. So I don't remember if it was the Idaho Press or the Statesman. It was one of the local papers. They had a list with numbers of Idahoans that have died from, I think it was 2017, the number of Idahoans that died where they know it was in part by or totally caused by distracted driving from a mobile device. I think it was 17 people in 1 year. So that's 17 people that we know died from distracted driving. And just to expand a little bit on what Sergeant Frazier said, the chief feels, and I don't want to put words in the chief's mouth, but I've listened to him talk. I was at last week's council meeting. I was the only person here that testified. He was trying to prevent crashes. He's trying to prevent people from dying, right? With an infraction, you don't have to have, it doesn't have the same level of severity, like a crash doesn't have to occur for somebody to receive an infraction. So the goal here is to prevent crashes, prevent deaths, prevent injury by changing people's behaviors. And quite frankly, if somebody doesn't know they come into Meridian where they can't use a cell phone if this passes, and they come in from Boise, I don't care. They shouldn't be using their phone anywhere. So I just wanted to offer that up.
Very good. Anything else for Sergeant Frazier?
Mr. Chairman, I have another question.
About 30 seconds worth?
Yeah,
Okay.
yes. So I'm curious, out of, crashes that are related to, electronic device, distracted driving, is there is it an age issue? Is it all ages? What do you see, or what are you aware of? Is it old guys like us that are the problem, or is it, the new teenage drivers, or is it all over the place?
At the risk of, there's probably not a whole lot of scientific data to back this up, but generally across the board, we see people aged 40 and under ferociously using handheld wireless devices on the roadway. The people that are causing those crashes tend to be the middle of the pack, not the oldest users in the group, and not the youngest, because young people today are rather adept at using their handheld wireless device while driving, especially when you're driving the gigantic billboard police car. So we see that middle of the pack, and it's really just a small, that extra lapse in judgment. It's handheld wireless device coupled with you're following somebody too closely. Put those two things together, and that's how you end up with a crash taking place. Certainly there's the examples where people have died. When you look at highway deaths across Idaho, it's pretty much distracted driving and impaired driving are the two biggest contributors, and that makes up almost 2/3 of those statistics. So that's the unofficial scientific response. It's the middle of that pack, and you see it driving around down Eagle Road and down the interstate. I would argue that the majority of people that you see in a car are using a handheld wireless device, at least have it in their hand, and pretty much everybody has one in the car.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Very good. Okay, 5B, we can close. Very good.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all. See you
Thank
next
you for
time.
coming. Comprehensive plan update, Mr. Hood.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Members of the commission, on page 23 of your packet, I can get there. I did put together a memo, and this probably has more information than you were hoping for, but it's there for you anyways. Just kind of outlining the entire process for the comprehensive plan. Some of you, most of you, participated in one of the focus groups that helped look at some of the corridor analysis and a master street map, a master mobility map. Early this year, I think it was in January, February type time frame. The application has been submitted for the Planning and Zoning Commission and City Council consideration. The first hearing before our Planning and Zoning Commission is on October 17th. So that's next Thursday at 5:30 here in this room. Again, I'm not going to read the memo to you. It has a whole lot of information. Again, majority of it actually isn't transportation related, but more process and how we develop the plan and what's in the plan and even the purpose of the plan. But I thought I'd just give you that information, kind of close the loop on that. We will be talking about that master mobility map from time to time going forward still as we look to integrate and expand that tool. After we get the comp plan adopted, we'll put that map on our website as well, get some feedback from users on, again, how it could be a better tool. I didn't have much of a presentation on this item. It was more just to kind of let you know the status of the comprehensive plan. And again, if you're interested in participating further in that, public hearing on the 17th of this month. And then anticipate is pending the Planning and Zoning Commission recommending, making a recommendation to the City Council, probably about that same time, mid-November, would probably be when the City Council hearing will be on this as well. So that concludes my update.
Comments, questions for Mr. Hood? Mr. Hood, on behalf of myself, I would like to thank the invitation that you held out to work on those subcommittees and go to the public events. For myself, I found that very worthwhile and also educational, and just helps you to learn more about the city. So I appreciate all your efforts, sir. Comprehensive Plan Update 5C, complete staff communications. Mr. Hood?
Thank you again, Mr. Chair. Page 31 are staff communications for this month. Again, I'm not going to read these to you. I know you all can read. I do want to call a couple of them to your attention, though. The first one, just circle up back again, kind of close the loop, if you will, unless we want to talk some more. But we talked about, and the school zone committee was actually even formulated. That was the spring too, I believe. We met and talked about the speed zone at Mountain View High School, or Rocky Mountain, High School, on Linder Road. And Mr. Martin sent me an email, I don't know, must have been in the last couple of weeks anyways, I can't remember exactly, saying they went out there and did some more analysis after school had started. If you recall, our last request was to move the school zone flashers south of the intersection there at Coyotes Creek. Again, I'll let you read that, but ACHD thinks that where they are makes the most sense. So just want to kind of, again, close the loop on that one. I actually, and we have, again, Mr. Updike here, I don't know if that northernmost driveway, if any changes, we talked about asking the school district to potentially sign that for right in, right out type of movements. I don't know if that's actually happened or not, or what the plan is there. But that was also part of that same dialogue and discussion that we had. And I'm not trying to put him on the spot necessarily, but just wanted to, again, bring that back before you all and share this information. I think the next one I wanted to share is, and it's just an FYI, and it's more an FYI because it may be coming before you. Page 33 of 34, our police department, our fire department, and even some members of our city council have been engaged on some parking concerns in Kelly Creek subdivision. McMillan, basically across from Hunter Elementary, if you're familiar with that part of town. There's some subway apartments that are on the north side, again, basically directly across from Hunter Elementary, and some overflow parking spilling off into the neighborhood there. What I understood the concern to be was parking on Goddard Creek, which is a residential collector. When ACHD went out there, they didn't necessarily witness that. I've since heard from some other neighbors that have had some concerns about parking on some of the east-west streets and blocking driveways and some of those other concerns. But they are public streets, and people can park on public streets. And but I just want to let you know they may want to come and bend your ear as well, talk to you a little bit about that, see what can be done. But these are largely what appears to me as local public streets, and as long as you aren't parking in front of fire hydrants and blocking people's driveways, regardless of if they're apartment visitors or dwellers or your neighbor, you can park along public streets, so unless signed otherwise. So just wanted to, again, give you a heads up. I don't know that it'll turn into anything. There is definitely concern out there in that neighborhood from some about the parking on those streets. So with that, those are the few communications from this last month I thought you might be curious about. With that, Mr. Chair, I stand for any questions.
Comments, questions for Mr. Hood on staff communications? Hearing none, seeing none. 5D is closed for this session. 6, future meeting topics. Main King Crosswalk. Highway 69 traffic study in November. Fixed route transit. Any new ideas? Okay,
Mr. Chair, again, I would just let you know that that master mobility map, I'm going to add that back on a future meeting topic. I don't know if that'll be next month, but here in the coming month, so I'm going to add that to the list as well.
okay. Not on the agenda, but by executive privilege, I always open it up for random comments or thoughts for the good of the commission. Are there any today to discuss? Okay. Next meeting is November 4th. Get out and vote. I think I can say that to encourage everyone. And with that, is there a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
All right, see you in a month. Thank you.
Second.